Welcome to Novara Live, coming to you from my home in Nottingham, as 36-degree temperatures does not a happy studio make down at Novara Towers. However, coming up on tonight's show, voters in Clacton go to the polls today as Nigel Farage risks losing his career to a talking bin. Netanyahu has rejected Donald Trump's 15-point plan for Gaza. Owen Jones takes on a cheerleader of Israel's genocide, and Karoline Leavitt is leaving the White House. I'm Helena, otherwise known as NoJusticeMTG, and tonight I'm remotely joined again by Dalia Gebrial for Ladies' Night. How are you doing, Dalia?
Helena, I'm doing well. It's getting very hot in here, but I won't be taking all my clothes off so that this video doesn't get demonetized.
Absolutely, we need to get that sweet AdSense revenue. But obviously the best way of supporting the channel is to go to novara.media/support to be able to become a contributor to the channel. And as always, make sure to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and leave your comments in the comments section down below. After two very high-profile by-elections already this year, in Makerfield and in Gorton and Denton, tonight we'll see yet another empty seat being filled, although this one was triggered by the resignation of one of its contestants in the form of Reform UK leader Nigel Farage. He broadcast himself publicly throwing his toys out of the pram last month and standing down in his seat of Clacton, forcing a by-election to prove he has the backing of the people versus the establishment in the wake of a Parliamentary Standards Commission investigation into an undeclared donation from a Thai-based crypto billionaire worth £5 million. The issue for Farage is that the establishment haven't turned up. All four of the main English political parties declined the invitation to participate in Farage's stunt, meaning Farage will only face down a gaggle of protest parties and meme candidates in the 34 name-long ballots getting marked today. Yes, there are 34 candidates standing in this by-election. The ballots are very, very long. Out of those many meme candidates, only one of them has gained notoriety as their main competition to Farage, the comedy character of Cam Binface. He's been a mainstay political parody candidate for years now. Here he is, immortalised in history, next to now Prime Minister Andy Burnham at the results of the Makerfield by-election earlier this year. Armed with a manifesto of joke policies such as capping 99 flakes at 99p, and satirical ones such as a pledge to spend more time in Clacton-on-Sea than Washington DC, he's been generating lots of buzz on social media, not just in the UK, but around the world, even making it as far as the news in Japan.
クラクトンの下院議員補欠選挙への出馬を表明しました。
ビンフェイス伯爵は宇宙から来たということなんですが、待ち合わせはこの一見して普通のビルの中です。一体どんな人物なんでしょうか。
取材依頼が殺到する中、日本メディアでは JNN が独占取材を許可されました。
Hello, it's a pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Honor. Konnichiwa.
Konnichiwa. So you speak Japanese?
I have a smattering. I'm fluent in over 7 million forms of communication.
I don't think this was the kind of international acclaim that Nigel Farage was hoping this by-election would draw, to be honest. Now, Farage was asked in a recent interview with the Daily Express to comment on his parody opponent, however, and also to comment on the lack of the other opposition in Clacton.
Have you met Count Binface? Do you like him?
I've not met him, no. He's an extreme left-wing BBC comedy writer. You know, he writes the sketches for the now very unfunny Have I Got News For You. So he's not quite the joke character that you would have thought. I have spoken on the phone to the leader of the official Monster Raving Loony Party. I've known Alan for 20 years, and they have had one over on the electoral system because they officially endorsed three candidates. And no one's ever done that before in British politics, so they're absolutely wetting themselves with laughter. One or two of the independents have reached out, but look, you know, I mean, when David Davis did this back in 2008, I think there were 28 candidates. Now there are 34. I will say this, that in this area, the Conservatives have done themselves the most enormous damage. A lot of voters on the door say we are deeply insulted. There is not a Conservative candidate, and I say that in the context that as recently as 2019, the Tories got 72% of the vote here. And they're just not here at all. So long term, it's really odd. 2 years in a row, the Tories tried to stop the Essex County Council elections from going ahead. They went ahead because of a legal action that I brought. They don't want a general election, and they haven't put a candidate up here. So I think long term, they've made a really bad error.
The problem that Farage has is that whilst he can try and claim that the Conservative Party are undermining their own voters in Clacton by refusing to stand a candidate, because of course they even got lots of votes at the last general election too. The problem is that he is the one undermining the electoral process in Clacton by calling this by-election in the first place, because there could well be another by-election sometime soon, given the fact that if he wins this by-election, which, he may not do. I mean, at the current polling, it looks like he's going to get about 70%, to with Count Bin-Face on around about 30%, which would be a humiliation. If he gets, less than 70%, it would go from being cringe to a humiliation for him. But assuming he does get re-elected to Parliament, that Parliamentary Standards Commission investigation into that £5 million donation from the crypto billionaire, that will restart immediately. If it's found to have broken the rules and he gets suspended for more than 10 days, there could be a recall petition, and we could be ending this whole situation all over again, where there'll be another parliamentary by-election where the Conservative Party will stand a candidate. And Farage's point that these people are having their votes taken for granted, or their participation in democracy taken for granted, he's going to be the one who looks silly when he's got to go through the whole electoral process all over again, dragging the voters of Clacton all the way through the polls yet again taking their votes for granted, whilst the Conservatives and other political parties who have an electorate in this constituency have played their cards correctly in only standing in the one by-election that matters, the one that Nigel Farage will have been forced to stand in, where his competition will be real, rather than the one that he's called himself for a political stunt, which now everyone sees to be the stunt for what it is. Now, he's not the only one to try and imply that the Count is some secret lefty, however, too. Here's GB News contributor Adam Brooks responding to reports alleging that the mainstream parties have been canvassing against Farage. The establishment will do anything to stop Nigel Farage. I'm disgusted at these people. They clearly don't care if the people of Clacton have a left-wing joker as MP. Traitors. I see we've gone from calling Ben Wallace a traitor to now calling all of the political parties traitors for backing a parody candidate against a political party that they oppose, right? That's how politics works, Adam. You're supposed to oppose your political opponents, right? Like, you don't just give them a free run at re-election in all cases. I think that backing somebody who might potentially embarrass your political opponents is just part of the whole business of engaging in the act of opposition in this case. What I will point out, though, is that if you're trying to market Count Bin-Face as a joke candidate, as a parody candidate, someone who's there to undermine the whole fact that this by-election has been called in the first place, the idea that the establishment parties would then go and back them undermines that, and it helps lionize, it helps reify Nigel Farage's position and his rhetoric around it being a people versus the establishment by-election. Like, Count Bin-Face is supposed to be this parody candidate that people are voting for to try and upend Nigel Farage for, joke reasons, rather than a serious candidate with the backing of the political establishment. That's what Nigel Farage wants. As for Count Bin-Face being some kind of lefty, he's mostly just a bit of a common or garden liberal, and in terms of his political activism as a parody candidate, he's parodied everybody. He parodied Andy Burnham in Makerfield, he parodied all the other political parties in previous by-elections when he stood against prime ministers or political leaders in the past. The idea that he only goes after the right wing and is some kind of crazy left-winger when he's been very critical of people like Corbyn and Polanski is nonsensical as far as I'm concerned. Dalia, what do you make of Farage's stunt here? Do you think it'll pay off, or do you think he's looking at the barrel of humiliation?
I have to say, I have really enjoyed this season of British politics where we've been watching Nigel Farage, very earnestly describing this by-election as him against the establishment. And then it's like camera pans and the establishment is a man with a bin on his head. And I have this wonderful image of like countries all over the world, like tuning in and being like, what's going on in British politics? Seeing this farce and being like, this is the empire. This was the place that colonized us. Like, this is the empire. Like, what has happened? But I think the broader question here is, what is to become of Nigel Farage? There is a shift happening. I can't tell you yet whether it is decisive, but there is certainly a shift. For 18 months now, Farage has felt like a completely unstoppable force in British politics, and this by-election, which he, as you mentioned, Helena, has sort of engineered himself, which was triggered to try and avoid scrutiny over his own finances, is kind of a good moment to talk about what are the actual vulnerabilities in Project Farage that are kind of coming to the surface right now, and coming to the surface specifically through the nature of the crypto scandal and the ways in which he is being stress tested by the media in a way that he has not really ever been stress tested in his career. Because for me, the fundamental vulnerability in Farage is the fact that at his core, the only thing that he is more loyal to than anti-immigration politics is neoliberalism. So he represents the very politics that is currently making a lot of his newly acquired base really suffer, which is, economically insecure voters in the north and east of England. This Farage is a man who called Liz Truss's mini budget the best conservative budget since 1986. He absolutely believes that, the free market should hold ultimate power in governing society. And I would highly recommend reading Dan Trilling's most recent book. Dan Trilling has been a long-term journalist studying the far right in Britain. And he sort of talks about, well, where is the far right in this current moment? And he points out that Nigel Farage's three greatest political influences are Margaret Thatcher, Keith Joseph, and Enoch Powell. And these are three of the most important architects of neoliberalism and free market fundamentalism in this country and globally. And so that there's an irony there, which is that the man who worships neoliberalism has kind of become the single biggest political beneficiary of its collapse, and ultimately looking to Nigel Farage to sort of heal the wounds of neoliberalism is kind of like looking to the sun to heal your sunburn. Because the thing about Nigel Farage that no one really stress tests properly is that Reform's coalition, when you go beneath the anti-immigration sentiment, which they broadly all agree on, they don't really agree on much. A 2025 survey found that a quarter of Reform voters are those economically insecure voters, largely based in the north of east and east of England. They're strongly pro-welfare. They're strongly pro-state. They want better wages. They're pro-workers' rights. But then the other biggest chunk of his base are, around a fifth, are affluent voters who largely live in the south, who actually want the exact opposite. They want less state spending. They want no workers' rights. They want no state intervention other than state intervention that secures the rights of the market. And so they are fundamentally deeply opposed. These two groups don't agree on anything other than immigration. And even their politics of immigration and their opinions on immigration are kind of rooted beyond just racism, are rooted in two different things. The affluent Southerner hates immigration because they think that state spending is bad, full stop, and that immigrants are the biggest beneficiaries of state spending. If you get rid of all the immigrants, they certainly aren't going to believe that that the state should spend on white working class British people. Whereas the economically insecure Northerners and Easterners hate immigration because they like state spending, but they think that state spending is being disproportionately or erroneously spent on immigrants instead of them. So ultimately, Farage has never had to yet address that contradiction and show where his actual loyalties lie. He's never had to choose between them because the traditional media has never really been interested in anything other than the anti-immigration sentiment that has bound them together, because the media finds that to be an exciting and interesting and subversive story. So the question of what is going to happen to Farage going forward, is this going to be just a blip in a broader rise to power, or is this going to actually be the beginning of him being brought down, is really going to rely on whether or not we can really press that contradiction. Because when you strip it all back, Farage's heart has never been with that former Labour heartland, economically insecure voter in Clacton or Blackpool or Hartlepool or wherever. His heart, the consistent political core and his consistent political beliefs have always been with the affluent, neoliberal, anti-welfare, shred the state voter. That section of his base, that's always been his actual base from the very beginning. So the question of whether this is going to be, a little kind of diversion, or whether this is going to begin the highlighting of that contradiction that he's always gotten away with, really depends on how we as the left decide to press on that contradiction, because it is actually a weakness. And it's probably the only route we have to really stopping Farage becoming the next prime minister.
One thing I would say is I have noticed a real change in the media ecosystem and how they're dealing with Farage. He got a real boost from the establishment media for quite a while, up until the £5 million donation thing kicked off, and there was a perceived weakness, a perceived chink in the armour of Nigel Farage, alongside what we're seeing in terms of what's happening in Trump's America. And suddenly it feels like that the boosterism of the right-wing media has moved away from Farage and towards Kemi Badenoch. I think what a lot of the establishment media have done, and which has caused such a political crisis for Farage, is that they've seen the business outcomes of what Trumpism has done to America, which has overwhelmingly been bad for business, which is a lot of what these establishment media companies are there to represent the interests of the business community. And they've seen, actually, do we really want right-wing populism? Do we really want someone like Nigel Farage in charge of the country? Is that going to be good for business? And broadly, we've seen that that's not been the case in Trump's America. Something similar happening here wouldn't be good for the vested interests of the media class in this country. So I think the change from what I've seen, I don't know if you have the same experience, Dalia, of Farage boosterism towards Kemi boosterism, who gets precious little criticism from the mainstream media at all, outside of the neo-Nazi stuff we covered last week. Have you seen that kind of shift there, or am I putting the cart before the horse here?
I think it's interesting what you say. I think whether or not Trumpism has been good for business in the US, I think is a contested question. I think it's been really good for some business, and it's been not so good for other business. When we talk about kind of the economic elite or business interests, this is not a homogenous force. It's not a completely united force. There are contradictions and factions within it, and Trumpism has certainly bolstered some of that, and perhaps been a bit more tricky for other parts. I think what might be true, however, is that Trumpism has been bad for media, in the sense that it's been, bad for journalists. The journalists and the press are getting routinely humiliated and chewed up by Trump. And we're going to come on to the Karoline Leavitt story soon. But overall, Trump has really, as part of his strategy to look like a populist, has really fomented hatred against the press and against journalism. I'm not someone to sit here and say that, the press is wonderful and the press as it currently stands must be defended at all costs. But I can imagine that, like, if you are a journalist or if you are an editor, you probably don't want someone to come along and just bash you over the head and turn people against you, or make the public distrust you. So I wonder if that's kind of part of it. But I also think that it's not so much that the media are hounding Farage right now. I think it's more a contrast to how soft the treatment has been thus far. The treatment, the endless puff pieces, the ability to have, host positions on key radio channels, the ability to be on Question Time constantly, even though you have been running to be a member of parliament. You ran to be a member of parliament for 30 years before you actually managed to get elected as an MP. The affability of the press and the desire of the press to platform Farage in a way that completely outsized whatever legitimate claim he might have to representing a serious part of the British political system was so unusual and so strange that even the most basic stress testing, which every political figure of significance in this country is put through, seems to be like a real change. I think what we're seeing more is a matter of contrast to what has been actually quite historically unusual soft hand treatment. And the reason that they had that soft hand treatment is because Nigel Farage, much like Trump, is really good at generating stories. He's really good at generating entertainment. He's really good at pulling stunts, at saying things that feel like an exciting story to tell and that feels like it sells newspapers. He was kind of, at a time when British politics felt like there was very little difference between the different political parties. It was very boring. It was kind of very flatlined. There wasn't a huge amount going on. Farage came and brought entertainment. He brought something different. He was like an interesting character. And, I think my theory is that a lot of journalists are kind of failed novelists who just like to sort of write good stories. And I think that, alongside with the fact that his actual politics don't really threaten most vested interests in this country, because as I said, he's a rampant neoliberal, made for quite a fun, comfortable relationship between, and mutually sort of symbiotic relationship, mutually beneficial relationship between Farage and the press. And I think the dual threat of Farage premiership potentially being based on sowing hatred of the press, say hatred against the press in the way that it did with Trump, and the fact that he is now undeniably a serious political figure, has led the press to treat him a little bit more like a normal politician, which they never really did that before.
And I think another thing as well is that in the same way that Starmer got incredibly favourable press in the run-up to the 2024 election, is that the press perceived him to be the heir apparent. And that was the case with Farage for a long time too, when Reform were 30% in the polls. There were projections showing that with 400 seats, a Starmer-style supermajority. And if they'd ever crossed him in the wrong way up until he became Prime Minister, suddenly they'd lose access, and they'd lose access to all the stories, all the good copy. That would all go away once they had engaged in some kind of hostile relationship with the Prime Minister-to-be. And so they wanted to make sure they maintained good relationships with the political parties. Now that's less assured. Now that it's a bit more up in the air who the next PM is, they're feeling a little bit more okay to be a little bit further critical of Farage and Faragism, because it's not guaranteed that he's going to be the next Prime Minister. We'll have to wait and see. The world's attention may have moved away from Gaza, but the Israeli government certainly hasn't. And all the signs now pointing in a single conclusion. As many of us have argued since the start of the genocide nearly 3 years ago, Israel clearly intends to stay in Gaza. Over the weekend, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu explicitly rejected US President Donald Trump's 15-point peace plan. That came about after Hamas had agreed to disarm. According to the plan, Hamas's disarmament process should go hand in hand with a phased withdrawal of Israeli troops from the enclave. Netanyahu, however, immediately shifted the goalposts, saying the military would only withdraw after the complete disarmament of the group. And today, Israel Katz, the country's defense minister, has instructed troops to prepare for a long-term stay in all three of the major territory Israel now occupies militarily, namely South Lebanon, Syria's Golan Heights, and Gaza, promising that there will be no withdrawal from any of them. For his part, Trump doesn't seem particularly bothered by Netanyahu's unilateral tanking of his plans, even if it was one the most experts claimed would never work. Netanyahu, however, will face crucial elections in October. Recent polling conducted by The Economist shows that right now, Netanyahu's right-wing coalition government is not on track to retain a majority of seats in Israel's parliament, the Knesset, nor is any other party. Netanyahu has lost favour over various domestic policies, including the cost of living, because, surprise, surprise, forever war's quite expensive. But there remains little opposition to his genocidal military strategy in Gaza, with his main opponents differing only on the details. And his party, Likud, has shown every sign of moving towards even more extreme positions on Palestinians ahead of October. On Wednesday, the party changed its rules to create a place for far-right politician Almog Cohen, who early this year said, quote, "My feeling for revenge is yet to be satisfied. I want more revenge. I want more of the blood of the enemy who slaughtered our children, raped our women, and burned our homes." He's talking about civilians there. But that is, of course, what the Israeli military is very good at doing, killing civilians. In an extraordinary article in Israeli newspaper Haaretz, one soldier involved in that killing has claimed she was fooled by the Israeli army into killing children, saying they had told her she was only killing terrorists. The 22-year-old enlisted in the IDF in 2022 and served in both Gaza and Lebanon in what's being called the Forward Fire Command Center. That's an armoured personnel carrier containing the systems used to determine targets for artillery fire. In her time in the army, she helped Israeli soldiers fire thousands of shells, only realizing that maybe, just maybe, something was off when she left the IDF. She told Haaretz this: "I left the army and saw the number of children killed, and I was shocked. I started searching obsessively for information online. I looked for the neighborhoods we attacked, the villages. I saw that many innocent people were killed in these places. I saw pictures of dead children. In the army they told us we only kill terrorists, but that's a lie. Artillery fire is imprecise. The army considers a hit within a 50-meter radius to be a good hit. She also detailed the impact her murders have had on her. I have nightmares. I see inside my head dead children, crying mothers. I imagine how the bodies are removed. The guilt doesn't leave me. How can it? I killed an innocent child. I was the one who fed the targets. It's on me. Well, she's not wrong. Still, killing all those kids seems to have taught her some lessons, with the former soldier saying this. Before the army, I was an extreme right-winger, one who would say death to Arabs. That was the myth in school that influenced me. But after the war, I understood that there's a difference between Hamas terrorists and Palestinian civilians who want peace, who want life. I saw the conditions in which Gazans live. I realized there must be a change, that we must strive for equality, for peace. This is the only way to save children, to save us all. Well, this genocidal sob-story was published by Haaretz, Israel's most liberal newspaper. If that's what counts as opposition to genocide in Israel, there'll be no end to the Israeli military crushing of Gaza, the West Bank and South Lebanon, whether by Netanyahu or a potential identikit replacement in October. And while Israeli soldiers are complaining about the lack of post-genocide therapy they're getting, don't worry, our own government have been chipping in. Declassified has reported today on how British taxpayers have been funding therapeutic healing for Israeli soldiers, after an Israeli charity was able to claim gift aid in the UK. The investigation reveals this. Emails obtained by Declassified show how the Yahalom Foundation, an Israeli veterans group, tells British supporters to channel their donations via its registered partner platform in the United Kingdom. Processing your donation through them ensures you receive full tax recognition and enabled gift aid, maximising the impact of your contribution, it says. 100% of your gift is routed directly to Yahalom to support our core mission. The Yahalom Foundation directs British supporters to a list of fundraising projects for the IDF veterans, claiming that donations would be eligible for the tax subsidy. The list includes funding a £5,000 therapeutic healing journey for soldiers returning from Gaza, as well as individual psychological treatments. The foundation is also raising money for a £100,000 memorial hall to commemorate fallen Israeli soldiers. Now, Dalia, a couple of questions, I guess. Firstly, I want to ask you about the article in Haaretz involving the soldiers' kind of admission of the crimes that the IDF have been doing in Gaza and all the children that they've killed. Now, of course, it's a bit of a sob story, talk about how it's affecting her rather than, what the actual effects were on all of the children that she'd killed. But it does show just how much the ideology of the basis of the State of Israel, the ideology of Zionism, the ideology that is pushed upon the Israeli public in the way that they manufacture consent broadly for these far-right views that she'd previously held, that made her join the military in the first place to engage in this mass killing, engage in this genocide. It poisons the souls of the very people that it claims to want to protect. It poisons the population of Israel. So this is why we see these polls showing very heavy support in Israel for the genocide in Gaza and what it seems to be plurality, if not majority support for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, both in the West Bank and in Gaza, and potentially even Arab citizens of Israel as well. What did you make of her words there?
I think the first thing to say, really, and I think that there is something to be said for Israelis talking about how the most unbelievable racism and hatred is engendered at multiple stages of Israeli life, to help us understand how we get to a position like this. Because, of course, the typical story that has been told now, that the West has been told, is that Palestinians are taught to hate. There's this idea that Palestinian children are raised to hate Jewish people, and that's where this conflict comes from. And I think it's an important clarification to say that actually a lot of that structural engendered hatred and belief in the dehumanization of the other is actually happening within Israel. And I think there is a broader danger here that I worry about, that, if Netanyahu loses this election in October or loses his majority, that there's a risk that the West will misread that as the kind of end of the problem, because now a lot of pro-Israel voices in the West have worked very hard to make this out to be a Netanyahu problem, that this is an individual failure of Netanyahu's leadership, that Netanyahu is uniquely bloodthirsty in Israeli society. But that's obviously not where dissent against Netanyahu from within Israel is coming. In fact, it's actually quite the opposite. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with Netanyahu, believing that he has not gone far enough. And the rest of it is kind of just fatigue. Netanyahu has been prime minister forever. And, he spends half of his time in court fighting corruption charges. So there's that kind of very internal domestic frustration with Netanyahu. So it's not really about a reflection of a broader sort of dissatisfaction or dissent with the actual project of the elimination of the Palestinians. That is quite a consensus across the Israeli political spectrum. When it comes to the Haaretz piece, these soldiers describing having severe PTSD and, not being able to get adequate healthcare in context of that, the first thing I would say to that is the only way that Israeli society will be able to address that within them is by stopping and is by reparations. It's not through individual psychotherapy. That doesn't leave you that kind of internal damage of your soul. But also it's difficult to read when you are thinking about what it means sitting next to what is happening on the other side of the fence. There's a lot of talk here about the soldiers with PTSD. I can't help but think about how psychologists working in Palestine have been saying for a while now that the trauma in Gaza is so severe, so relentless, that it has actually broken our existing clinical understanding of trauma. Dr. Samah Jabra, who is the chair of the mental health unit at the Palestinian Ministry of Health, has argued that we need an entirely new framework of trauma to explain and describe what is happening in Gaza. She calls it CTSD, continued traumatic stress disorder, because Gazans and Palestinians in Gaza are never reaching the state of post. When you have this compounding effect of living in the most severe imaginable state of abject horror, it produces something very different and something that can't be healed in the ways of in the existing clinical understandings of trauma. Changes to personality, changes to belief systems, to coping mechanisms at a whole population level. An inability to have a baseline of safety to return to. And so that's why, even before October 7th, in 2022, there was a survey that found that, 4 in 5 children in Gaza experience depression and grief, and 3 in 5 children are actually self-harming. And so that is, in a sense, has always been a kind of deeper problem with the way in which Western-centric understandings of trauma have existed. Most of our evidence base for trauma studies have come from veterans, have come from soldiers who have gone to war, experienced horrors, conducted horrors, and then come back to a place of relative safety, but have been unable to shake the kind of trauma of what they've done and what they've seen. And actually very little of our understanding of trauma looks at the other side of that and looks at what does it mean for the people who were on the receiving end of that attack and whose infrastructure and families and countries and land have been destroyed irreversibly as a result of that. So this is an ongoing problem in kind of the way in which we just sort of don't view people in the global south as humans in the way that we view others, humans who have interior lives, who have emotional lives. But it also speaks to a kind of specific contrast that we can see right now of the discussions happening in Israel around PTSD and, shock and claims that we need to have, that there needs to be more mental health help for soldiers returning from Gaza, when on the other side of the fence, there aren't even ICU units to treat people who are in acute health, like physical health crises, like on the brink of death, let alone before we get to the question of how do you mentally heal, psychologically heal from what's happened, which is a whole different question. And personally, I would quite like my taxpayer money to be going towards dealing with that issue. That's actually where our political and moral responsibility lies, because that is an outcome of the harm that the British state has helped to perpetuate. That, to me, is really the emergency here.
It's been a while since YouTuber Piers Morgan has enlisted the services of Owen Jones in the trenches of the online political warfare that his uncensored channel has become of late. Luckily for us, however, Owen was back on the channel this week to debate columnist for Newsweek Josh Hammer on the subject of Israel's genocide in Gaza. And as you can imagine, just as all debates with Zionists end up, it involved Owen Jones having to debunk a whole host of lies. Let's take a look at what happened.
If this had happened in, let's call it Texas, if you had thousands of Sinaloa cartel commanders who came across the border and just blindly mutilated and raped and butchered. They put babies in ovens. They executed women point blank range on their home. How would the United States respond? How would we respond? These are the kind of questions that have gone so far removed from this debate. And no matter how many fancy words like genocide get perversely and morally incorrectly and legally incorrectly tossed around, I think it's incumbent upon all the reasonable people to ground themselves in the basic facts. And Owen Jones can laugh his sorry ass off who he wants. No one in their right mind really ought to give a crap.
Can I just respond to something you've just? Well, I'll respond if you let me to what you just said there. You just said babies were put in ovens on 7th of October. Why lie like that? You know that's a lie.
I'm not lying.
You know that never happened.
Lying.
You know that never happened. You know not a single baby, one baby,
There's
which is a crime. Let me finish. No.
Of it.
You had a long spiel, and now I'm going to fact correct you because you can't just come on a show like this.
You don't do facts.
I know Piers likes accuracy. I know he likes accuracy in these discussions. No babies were put in an oven on 7th of October. One baby was killed on October 7th, which was bad enough. That's Mila Cohen. She was 8 months old. She was shot through the door of a safe room. That's the baby who was killed on 7th of October. That's a crime in itself. If that's a crime, which I say it is, by the way, how to describe 1,000 babies, 1,000 infants under the age of 1 killed in Gaza by Israel since 7th of October?
The babies in ovens claim is a now widely debunked hoax from the first 2 months after the Al-Aqsa flood on October the 7th. According to Haaretz, the claim had originated from the United Hatzalah president Eli Beer and were completely unverified. This was alongside other well-known hoaxes, such as the story of 40 supposedly beheaded babies that even Joe Biden spread without evidence, and another claim that was also debunked by the Al Jazeera investigative unit that the bodies of burned babies were allegedly found in Kibbutz Be'eri by the IDF. And I think what this shows is just how much of a bubble the internet creates for a lot of people, especially if you're somebody who doesn't like responding to things that counteract your narrative, insofar as this guy seemed genuinely convinced. I know it's easy to believe that a lot of propagandists are just lying because they want to make sure that people stay in the dark, but a lot of people, I think, genuinely have accepted a bunch of pro-Zionist propaganda. They accepted a bunch of the atrocity propaganda on October the 7th because they wanted to be able to justify thinking of everybody who was in Palestine, all members of all different resistance groups, all of being total barbarians with no regard for humanity at all, because A, it would justify all their preconceived biases against people like the Palestinians, against Arabs, against people from the global south, and on top of that, to be able to justify whatever reaction came from Netanyahu, from the Israeli government, from the IDF in response to what happened on October the 7th. Again, there were lots of bad things that happened on October the 7th. You don't need to do this atrocity propaganda unless you're specifically using it to try and then post hoc or pre hoc justify other such atrocities happening in the other direction from the IDF. Now, Owen then put some of Hammer's own statements to him. Here's how he responded.
I would just note with you, because you are a supporter of genocide, and I will make that very clear.
I am not.
You said about the Palestinian population of Gaza, you said this is a radicalised population that deserves shame, scorn, and diplomatic rebuke. You weren't talking about Hamas.
They deserve
You
all
talked
that.
about the Palestinian population of Gaza. That's what you said. You also said large swathes of Gaza should resemble a parking lot
to every
in
single
October
parliamentary.
2023. You also called for the population transfer of the people, the survivors of Gaza, into other Arab states. You want Palestinians removed from Gaza. You don't want Palestinians to remain in Gaza. That's what you called for. You also called for the military occupation
I think it's a perfectly
or formal
reasonable option. By the way,
re-annexation
Donald Trump
of
also
Gaza.
publicly
That's what
floated
you
in
also
February
said.
2025.
Did you say that?
I never actually personally came out emphatically in favor of that, though. That's simply not true.
Did you say? Did you or did you not? I'm quoting for what you said. Did you not call for the population transfer of the people of Gaza?
No, first of all, I think it's a very reasonable option. By the way, there's a very long history of American presidents going literally back to the Hoover and Coolidge administrations that actually supported that. I've actually never explicitly endorsed that myself.
I've looked it up.
I have not. Donald Trump in February 2025 in the White House proposed this, by the way.
Yes, and you backed it.
And no, what I said is that, I mean,
you backed it.
Listen, I don't know whether your IQ is 2 or 3 standard deviations below the mean, but the way the negotiation works.
No, I'm just quoting what you said.
You start, no, but you need to learn a thing or two about negotiation. You start with a far out there claim, and then you arrive at a reasonable place of moderation. Donald Trump did this. It was his proposal to float the idea of popular transfer.
It's ethnic cleansing. It's called ethnic cleansing.
No one had their on their bingo card. No one even
if I called,
that
let me just make this clear. If I called for the Jewish population of Israel to be removed from Israel, which I don't support, I oppose. I want the peace and security of all those who live between the river Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. I want all of them to have equal rights. If I called for the population transfer of Jews from Israel, you would regard that as genocidal. And do you know what? You'd be absolutely correct. If I said the Jewish population of Israel deserves shame, scorn, and diplomatic rebuke, you would accuse me of being genocidal. You'd be correct. You said many gullible liberal elites pretend the radical jihadists of Hamas do not represent the broader Palestinian Arab population, but that is a lie. You believe in collective guilt and you believe in collective punishment. You said that Gaza should resemble a parking lot. You got your wish, by the way. You got your wish. Tens of thousands of innocent people killed later.
Of Gaza should resemble a parking lot, and that was literally on October 8th, 2023. This is how wars work.
It's so funny for him to sit there and say, well, actually, it's a perfectly reasonable solution of ethnic cleansing, but I never endorsed it. Well, we're about to find out whether he endorsed it. Now, here is the direct quote from Josh Hammer on ethnic cleansing that Owen's referencing. It was tweeted out, as he said, on October the 8th. Immediately evacuate as many identifiable civilians, no easy task, as possible from Gaza. Work with Egypt to take most in, ideally with diplomatic carrots and sticks. But if need be, a refugee swarm on the border fence and forcing Egypt's hand might be inevitable. And here he is, calling for vast swathes of Gaza to be turned into a parking lot. Flatten and raze to the ground anything remotely smacking of jihadist infrastructure in Gaza. Large swathes of Gaza should resemble a parking lot. The extent to which the entirety of Gaza and Hamas terror infrastructure, tunnels, rocket launchers, etc., are synonymous cannot be overstated. They are largely one and the same, with terror infrastructure embedded within civilian buildings. For good measure as well, here he is agreeing with ultra-Zionist Nachman Mostovsky on the use of excessive force in Gaza. Mostrovsky says that the Allies didn't stop Nazis and Imperial Japanese with targeted strikes. They bombed the ever-living shit out of Germany and Japan. Now it's Gaza's turn. Barbarians only understand utter destruction. To which Hammer responds, I believe the military term, which the civilized world has largely forgotten since World War II, is unconditional surrender. I would like to remind viewers at home that bombing the ever-living shit out of Japan involved the use of nuclear weapons, which was justified in explicit terms by Harry S. Truman as their method of achieving an unconditional surrender, which is clearly, from if what I'm guessing from that tweet, what Josh Hammer supports there. Dalia, what was your reaction to that debate?
I mean, immense frustration and kind of boredom, watching Josh Hammer and Owen Jones going at it on Piers Morgan. It just made me feel how tedious it's becoming that the press insists on relitigating who the victims are here, trying to pretend that is still where this discussion is at. We didn't have this debate when Russia invaded Ukraine, and we don't have it in any other case that is this clear cut. Only in this case have we, years after the fact, continue to have these tedious conversations trying to tease out and question who the aggressor and who the victim is here. And frankly, the world has moved past that framing. I mean, even J.D. Vance, who is not exactly known here for having pre-existing sympathies towards the Palestinians, said that Trump is the only head of state in the world that is still sympathetic to the country of Israel, which tells you that even, the US government, the US state, understands that Israel is broadly isolated, and throughout the world, their narrative of what has been happening is rejected. This idea that Israel is kind of the rightful occupiers of this land and the primary victims of a bad neighborhood, that idea is collapsing in basically all four corners of the earth. And, I have to be very clear here that even if public opinion wasn't strong it would still be, morally and politically correct to be in solidarity with the Palestinians. But the fact is, that is where public opinion is at. And public opinion is important because it can be a factor that shapes what actually happens next. If it meant nothing, Israel would not have poured, billions of dollars over the past several decades trying to shape it. So my question is, what is the function of the press continuing to act like this is a debate when in the minds of most reasonable people, it is no longer a debate? Because it's a delay tactic. Because what we have to really understand here is that as far as Israel is concerned, if you're looking at this from the perspective of the Israeli state, this war on Gaza is the final war. It is the war that in their view, is going to end this problem of Gaza, which has been a problem for 70 years in their eyes. And the resolution to that problem is elimination, whether it's through genocide or through displacement or through a combination, most likely, of the two. And the longer that this drags on in this kind of realm of discussion, the more time they have to achieve that objective. The Israeli state knows that the clock is ticking. Time is running out. They know that public opinion is either turning or has already turned. They know the ICJ ruling is damning and that it's likely when it comes in its final form is going to be even more damning. They know that politicians throughout the world understand that showing uncritical support for Israel is a political and electoral liability. So the strategy here is really simple. The strategy is, run out the clock, get what you can done in the time that you can get it done, and we'll clean it up when the problem has been solved. The problem being the existence of Palestinians on this land. And it's very telling to me that in those tweets from Josh Hammer, and this is something that a lot of pro-Israel voices do, they use atrocities committed by the US, like dropping the nuclear bomb, in order to legitimize Israel's right to conduct similar atrocities. They'll say, basically under the idea that it's unfair to say that, the US can commit atrocities, Britain can commit atrocities, and we can't. And I think that is actually the calculation being made here. I think that as far as the Israeli state is concerned, and a lot of people in Israel are concerned, a country like the US is a state that was born out of a broadly successful genocide. And, they got away with it. Why can't we? Then no one now questions the US's ability to exist. No one really talks about the history of that genocide. The difference is that the world's eyes weren't on that genocide. The world's eyes weren't watching. And also there wasn't an international legal framework that was ostensibly supposed to stop it happening again. Does that mean that Israel definitely won't be able to get away with what a state like the US was able to get away with in the past? Not necessarily, but it does mean that Israel is operating in slightly different conditions, and is why they are coming up against a level of resistance that they experience as an unfairness of double standards.
Now, in other more encouraging news, it looks like at least one of the abilities for Israel to garner cultural capital has been kept in check. Eurovision have announced plans to stop countries from hosting Eurovision should they be involved in armed conflicts or sensitive geopolitical situations, meaning Israel will almost certainly be barred from hosting the competition should they win in future. Obviously, there's plenty of cultural capital to be had merely in competing in Eurovision, and Tel Aviv is well aware of this fact. Israeli broadcast editor Eran Gebrial described Eurovision as a critical arena for Israeli advocacy, and the Israeli government has spent millions on propagandizing the contest. So whilst a hosting ban doesn't go far enough in my opinion, it at least stymies the potential of the Hasbro going into overdrive should Israel win the contest in future. Dalia, an encouraging development, you think?
Not entirely, and I'll get on to why I think so in a minute. I've always found Israel's participation in Eurovision really funny. It kind of speaks to the heart of Israel's identity crisis, which is, are we an outpost of Western civilization, fighting the barbarians in their own land, or are we indigenous to the land that the barbarians are currently occupying? I mean, look, I'm not one to kind of sit here and police the racial borders of Europe. But it's curious to me, given that that is normally how the borders of Europe are policed. But when we think about, you know, whether or not this is really Eurovision taking a stand, first of all, we need to understand that Eurovision has done this because of immense backlash. So it's not something that Eurovision has done because of some kind of, you know, internal principle. You know, there was people rightly pointed out that Russia was immediately banned from the contest, not just from hosting, but from participating. And that was because Russia was credibly considered to be doing war crimes. Why is it not the same for Israel? And as a result, 5 countries boycotted Eurovision, as did a lot of viewers. So they've tried to get out of that in possibly the most cowardly way possible. Firstly, obviously, they've not actually banned Israel in the way that they did with Russia. They've, you know, so they're still giving Israel this like special treatment. And secondly, because when you actually look at the press release that the EBU, which is kind of the broadcasting company that airs Eurovision, you'll see that their press release was very different to the one that they released when they banned Russia. When they banned Russia, they were very specific about who they were banning and why. It was, we are banning Russia, and they named Russia, and we are banning them because of the incursion into Ukraine. Whereas this is a very different press release. This is a press release that doesn't name Israel, obviously doesn't name Palestine. It kind of just issues this kind of blanket neutral law that says, you know, if you are involved in geopolitically sensitive wars, which I'm going to be interested to see how they, you know, continue to frame that as future wars probably take place, probably led by Europe, or at least heavily involved in with European countries, that if you are involved in a war or start a war that is geopolitically sensitive, then you cannot host it. That's a very different level of language, of directness of language compared to the Russia-Ukraine instance. So they really tried to kind of appease some of the noise that has cost them quite a lot of money and cost them some viewers, and kind of made them have to deal with some of the inherently political questions of Eurovision, but doing the absolute minimum. And the reason that this is problematic is because we actually really have to put Israel's participation in the Eurovision contest in context here. You know, I said earlier, you know, why does Israel participate in the Eurovision contest when it doesn't consider itself to be European? It considers itself to be indigenous to the Middle East. The reason that that the context of this makes the cowardice of Eurovision sharper is because in 2007, the Israeli government set up this campaign called Brand Israel, which was basically had this explicit aim of trying to improve the image of Israel by establishing it as this kind of cosmopolitan, progressive, very westernized country. And it did that because Israel had gotten a reputation, because of what it has done, of being a place of, you know, instability, of being an unpopular place, a place that does unpopular things. People didn't think of it as like a tourist destination, for example. So we see this very heavy marketing of Israel as yes, a tourist destination, specifically a queer-friendly tourist destination, which is something it does in opposition to the kind of homophobia of the Middle East that we're always told about. We see, you know, the Women of the IDF campaign, which sort of shows, you know, sexy Israeli women soldiers, you know, luring people in to come to Israel and sort of to soften the image of the IDF. So when we say that Eurovision have to ban Israel, it's not just to punish them. It's not just random punishment. It's actually because the ongoing participation of Israel in things like Eurovision is part of Israel's strategy of getting away with occupation and genocide and war crimes. And so to allow the charade to continue without explicitly naming it is Eurovision allowing itself to continue to be used as a tool to whitewash war crimes, to whitewash genocide. Participation in Eurovision has been central to Brand Israel, which is explicitly a distraction and a whitewashing of Israeli war crimes. And Eurovision is tacitly continuing that to be the case by not naming and banning Israel and naming why Israel should be banned from a contest like this.
Washington, D.C. has just lost a true star in the satanic firmament that is the Donald Trump administration. Karoline Leavitt, beloved by the president for her, quote, machine gun lips, has announced she'll be stepping down from the role at the end of this month. Aged 27 when she got the job, she was the first member of Gen Z to hold the position, quickly proving that yes, that generation can be evil too. Leavitt, who recently had a second child, posted this on Twitter. The truth is, since returning to the White House after the birth of my daughter, I have felt in my heart that I cannot be the best mum my two young children deserve, while devoting the constant time, energy and attention required of the White House press secretary, and that is why I have ultimately made the bittersweet decision to depart the White House and embark on a new chapter in my life. Known for her bullying manner and impressive elasticity with the truth, Leavitt was beloved by Trump's MAGA base as she used her podium to justify illegal war, curb side street murders of American citizens by armed militias, and global tariffs that threatened to sink the United States economy. Clips of her attacks on the American press regularly went viral, as did her skillful dodges of questions related to Jeffrey Epstein. But what mattered most was that Trump loved her, declaring that no president had ever had a better press secretary than Karoline. Let's have a look at some of those hits.
You ever paid a tariff? Because I have.
They
don't get charged on foreign companies, they get charged on the importers.
And ultimately, when we have fair and balanced trade, which the American people have not seen in decades, as I said at the beginning, revenues will stay here, wages will go up, and our country will be made wealthy again. And I think it's insulting that you are trying to test my knowledge of economics and the decisions that this president has made. I'm now regret giving a question to the Associated Press.
Did the president ever spend hours at Jeffrey Epstein's house with a victim?
These emails prove absolutely nothing other than the fact that President Trump did nothing wrong. Why was Renee Good unfortunately and tragically killed?
Are you asking me my opinion? Because an ICE agent acted recklessly and killed her unjustifiably.
Oh, okay. So you're a biased reporter with a left-wing opinion.
What do you want me to do?
Yeah, because you're a left-wing hack. You're not a reporter. You're posing in this room as a journalist, and it's so clear by the premise of your question. And you and the people in the media who have such biases but fake like you're a journalist, you shouldn't even be sitting in that seat.
Did the United States airstrike a girls' elementary school and kill 175 people?
Not that we know of, Sean, and the Department of War is investigating this matter, and I would just tell you very strongly, the United States of America does not target civilians, unlike the rogue Iranian regime. With respect to the ongoing major combat operations in Iran, Operation Epic Fury is moving ahead successfully and according to plan.
Besides wrangling with the traditional press, Leavitt also opened up the White House press pool, reserving a seat in the briefing room for a series of new media journalists and influencers. Sounds like an innovation, except all were handpicked for their MAGA-supporting perspective in a move the normally conservative Atlantic magazine described as straight from North Korea. Now if you're worried that this is the last you'll see of Karoline, stay calm. Posting on Truth Social, Trump appeared to suggest she'd be back before long, writing this. Karoline will now be one of my top outside advisors and an influential voice within the Republican Party as we work to defy history and conclusively win the midterm elections. Karoline has been a real leader in the White House and has done a phenomenal job fighting for justice, liberty, and freedom since 2018, including our historic re-election campaign of 2024. Dalia, what did you make of the career? The life and times of Karoline Leavitt? Do you think we'll find such an enigmatic press secretary again?
I always assumed that her surname was pronounced Leavitt. And so whenever I heard the word Karoline Leavitt, my internal worm brain would be like, leave it, she ain't worth it.
Leave it, cuz, leave it.
But actually, no, she is worth it. She is very much worth it to Trump, not because she's some kind of sort of legendary comms operator by traditional standards. She's worth it because and the reason Trump loved her is because she really understood the dance that Trump plays with the media. And she was really good at cornering the media into playing along or leaving them with kind of no other option other than to play along, because Trump's sort of relationship with the press is not like his predecessors. You know, traditionally, presidents broadly try to keep the press on side. Mainstream approval through the press is something that that previous presidents have courted. The whole job of a press secretary historically has been to get reporters to write favorable things about you. With Trump, it's the opposite. With Trump, the media actually is there to look like an adversary, like the enemy, because Trump's contract, the political contract, is not to actually dismantle elite powers that, have made the lives of most people in the US worse, but it's to look and feel like something that is dismantling that power. It's to look and feel like a brick that people can throw into the sort of glass house of the establishment, all whilst making sure that all those vested interests are allowed to kind of, corporate corruption is able to continue, that fundamentally sort of the flow of capital is not really disturbed. So even though it kind of looks hostile and broken, it's actually working quite well. The hostility is sort of part of the performance of Trumpism, and it's a performance that needs the media to kind of show up and play its part. That's why, Trump would never cancel those press briefings, even though he constantly threatens to, or he constantly threatens to ban journalists from it or ban media outlets from it. He'll kind of ban them for a couple and then always bring them back in because they're actually really important, because those kind of staged fights keep a signal, like is how he keeps signaling, I'm on your side against them, all whilst, cutting welfare, allowing corporate corruption to run rampant, dragging the US into more wars, doing things that are generally actually quite unpopular. So Karoline Leavitt, not Leavitt, was really good at playing that role. She was really good at generating these clips of herself, telling reporters off and clapping back and being rude and seeming really bullish. And on like a purely kind of like emotional, like libidinal level, that felt really good to watch for a lot of people. And it was really important to Trump's emotional contract with his voters. And I guess it kind of always put those of us who have a kind of long-standing, sensible critique of the media in a really odd spot, because obviously, Trump's critique of the press is not our critique. Ours comes from wanting the media to actually interrogate power, and for wanting a media industry that is not incentivized to kind of pal around with the people that it's supposed to be holding to account. Whereas Trump's approach was to not see the media as something that needs to be made more critical. I mean, presidents rarely do want that, but to see the media as a kind of an instrument, and one that he really knew how to play. Because what we forget about Trump is that before he's a businessman, before he's a politician, he is first and foremost a celebrity. That's his kind of grift. And so it puts us in a difficult position because we find ourselves sort of defending, these press outlets that in most contexts we would be heavily critical of. But it's because the argument is not the press shouldn't be allowed to ask questions, or if the press asks questions, it should just be responded to with this kind of theatre. Our argument was that the press should ask more questions and should not have its existence predicated on access, which always includes a kind of quid pro quo. So that is what Karoline Leavitt was really, really good at doing. It's why Trump really loved her. It's what the next one is probably going to do. But as for whether or not we're going to see more of her, when people say I'm resigning from this because I want to spend more time from my family, we rarely see them actually spend more time with their family. More often than not, it's to open a new chapter of their career. And I'm sure that Leavitt will go on to do what many press secretaries in recent history have done, which is go on to have sort of their own career as a political commentator of some kind.
It's an interesting point that you made about the kind of the choreographed dance between the media and Trump to be able to raise his profile, raise his celebrity. What's interesting is I think I can tell a politician who's done the similar kind of political strategy, and it's Zach Polanski. So I don't know if you've seen this, but Zach Polanski does this very frequently. He'll find negative articles about him from the media more broadly, will post it on social media to his followers and just go like, this is what the media is saying about me. They're not engaging in good faith. The media are trying to smear me. If you really want the politics of hope, you can join the Green Party, for example. And it's a symbiotic relationship, because the more that these articles have their profile raised, and presume it leads to more hits for whatever website or whichever newspaper has published this particular article. And the more that allows them to justify more articles smearing Zach Polanski, and the more it gives Zach more ammunition to go to his followers and say, look, establishment media still doesn't like me very much, and they keep posting it, and people lap it up. I think it's a really interesting dynamic there.
Yeah, and I think the difference between Trump and Polanski is that when Trump feels like there's, that particular outlet hasn't been fair to him, he'll just kind of go on a rampage and just be like, oh, the failing New York Times, their ratings are low, their sales are low, they're just a bunch of losers. And Zach Polanski will call them a loser as well, but more often than not, he'll pivot it towards, this is actually the issue that you should be caring about, and this is actually the solution that we have to that issue, and is actually able to present an offering that actually makes sense. Whereas with Trump, it's just theater. It's you. Yes, it's that same kind of using the weight of the press against you. But in his case, it is pure theater to cover for the fact that his actual politics don't fulfill any of the material promises that he's made to his base. Whereas I would hope that, if Polanski was prime minister, that would not be the case.
Well, exactly, yeah. Like, Polanski is being attacked because he provides policies that are unhelpful to the establishment that they oppose, like taxing the rich and more public investment, more nationalization in dealing with the climate crisis, whereas Trump is promising basically very little. He is hurt by the press because it undermines his own sense of self, it undermines his ego, whereas Polanski doesn't like the press because it's undermining a political prospectus to help the many, not the few. Thank you very much for joining me tonight, Dalia.
Thanks for having me, Lena, on Today Apocalypse Thursday.
Indeed so. I'm off to go and sit in front of a fan for the rest of today. Thank you everyone at home for watching as well. Come back for another Novara Live from 6 p.m. tomorrow. But for now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.